They called me the couch with legs. It wasn't a whisper, not even a sneer. It was a loud, careless joke that filled the room with laughter, and I was the only one not laughing. My grandson Dylan, barely 16, said it right in front of everyone at Sunday dinner, his mouth still half full of the roast potatoes I had spent the afternoon peeling, boiling, and seasoning. The rest of the family joined in the chuckle, but their eyes flickered away from me quickly, like the embarrassment was contagious and they were afraid to catch it. I remember the exact moment it hit me, the weight of those words, so cruelly tossed across the table, as if I were some spectacle, some punchline to entertain a crowd I no longer belonged to. I'm 78 years old now, living in a small apartment complex for seniors, surrounded by faces older than mine and memories that sometimes feel sharper than the present. But at that dinner, I was supposed to be the grandmother, the woman who had spent decades nourishing her family, the keeper of birthdays, stories, and traditions. Instead, I was reduced to a joke about my body, my age, my very existence. It stung, but not because I hadn't heard insults before. It stung because it was Dylan, the boy who once clung to my skirts, who once looked up at me with wide, trusting eyes, who now used those eyes to mock me with others watching. The burgundy sweater I wore that night, the one Derek used to say brought out the green in my eyes, felt like a costume I'd put on for a role I no longer inhabited. Sheila, my daughter, tried to laugh it off, a nervous, uncomfortable sound that barely hid her uncertainty. Ron, her husband, muttered something about teenagers being difficult, a phrase I'd heard too many times before, hollow and dismissive. No one said anything else. No one stood up for me. No one looked me in the eye. I pushed my chair back quietly and left the table before anyone could suggest I was being too sensitive, before the air could thicken with forced politeness or pity. Outside the dining room, the silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I stood by the window watching leaves dance in the early autumn breeze, feeling smaller than I had in years, as if the laughter from inside had carved away pieces of me with each chuckle. I wondered, not for the first time, how a grandmother could become invisible in her own family, how the love she gave so freely could be returned in whispers and sideways glances. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the teacup on the sideboard, the warmth a small comfort against the cold sinking into my chest. The years had passed quietly, filled with school runs, birthday cakes, broken bones mended with kisses, stories read late into the night, and now, at the end, I was nothing but a joke. I told myself it was just a boy being foolish, that this was the awkwardness of growing up, the cruelty of youth testing boundaries. But deep inside, the sting remained, lodged like a splinter beneath the skin. I was Martha, grandmother and caretaker, and I was hurt. That night I lay awake long after the house grew quiet. The soft sounds of the television downstairs mingled with the hum of the refrigerator, and the distant clock ticked with relentless precision. I thought about the family photos scattered around the house, some framed, others tucked away in drawers, images of smiling faces frozen in happier times. I thought about the years I'd spent making this house a home, the dinners served with a smile, the holidays celebrated with care, and the quiet sacrifices made so that others could thrive. I thought about Dylan's laughter, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the years of memories as if they meant nothing. Sleep was a stranger that night, and when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with faces both familiar and strange, all blurred by the fog of loss and longing. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that settled deep in my bones. The world outside the window was crisp and bright, the leaves turning gold and amber, reminding me that time marches on regardless of the wounds it leaves behind. I dressed carefully, choosing my burgundy sweater again, not out of vanity, but as a small act of defiance. I would not hide, even if I was hurt. The walk to the grocery store was slow, each step measured, a rhythm to steady my thoughts. People passed by with quick glances and polite nods, unaware of the storm swirling just beneath my calm exterior. At the store, I saw a group of teenagers gathered by the snack aisle, their laughter echoing too loudly, reminding me painfully of Dylan's words. I paused, clutching my shopping basket tighter, and whispered a promise to myself that this would not be the last time I spoke my truth. Back at home, I pulled out an old photo album, its pages yellowed and brittle. I traced my fingers over the pictures, stopping on one of Dylan as a small child, his eyes wide with wonder, reaching for my hand as we walked in the garden. That boy was still inside him somewhere, I told myself. The next Sunday, the house was filled with the usual chatter and clatter, but I arrived with a plan. Not revenge, not anger, but a quiet resolve to remind Dylan and the family who I was beneath the years and the wrinkles. I set up my laptop and prepared a presentation of old family photos and forgotten memories, the moments that spoke of love, struggle, and connection. As the TV screen flickered to life and the images began to fill the room, the laughter faded. I watched Dylan's face shift from amusement to something quieter, recognition, perhaps, or regret. The room held its breath as I spoke softly. People forget, but computers don't. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with things left unsaid. That night, Dylan sent me a message, short, hesitant, but real. "I didn't know you still saw me." I replied, "Always." It was a beginning. I am still here, still standing, still holding on to the memories that no joke can erase. And I know now it's not just about being seen, but about seeing yourself clearly enough to claim your own place at the table. That night after the dinner, I thought I could brush it off, that the sting of Dylan's cruel words would fade like so many other wounds I had carried quietly through the years. But I was wrong. It was not just a careless joke tossed around a table, it was a fracture. A quiet shattering of the fragile respect I once thought held our family together. The next day, as the sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of my apartment, I found myself lost in a restless fog, wondering how something so small could feel so enormous. When Sheila called to ask if I was all right, I hesitated before answering. Her voice was gentle but distant, as if she was trying to reach me across a growing chasm that I could feel but not quite name. "It's just Dylan being a teenager," she said, trying to comfort me. But her words felt like a dismissal, rather than solace. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't just Dylan, that the silence from everyone else that night had spoken volumes, louder than any insult. But I only said, "I'll be fine." The truth was, I wasn't fine. At the grocery store, I moved slowly down the aisles, my fingers grazing the shelves as if trying to anchor myself in something solid. The faces of strangers blurred past me, each one caught up in their own lives, unaware of the storm building inside my chest. I thought about the kitchen table where I'd sat the night before, the laughter ringing in my ears like a cruel echo. I thought about the way Dylan's eyes had sparkled with amusement, while mine had filled with something close to shame. And I wondered when exactly I had become invisible to my own family. Later that afternoon, I sat down at my old desktop computer, the one tucked away in the corner of my living room, gathering dust and memories in equal measure. It was there, almost forgotten, that I found the door to a world I hadn't visited in years. A digital drawer filled with fragments of Dylan's life, forgotten photos, screenshots, notes he'd written to himself, and videos he had never meant to share with anyone but had left stored on the hard drive. I started with the photos. There was Dylan as a small boy, eyes wide and curious, holding a puppy with tentative joy. There was a video of him at a school play, his voice cracking with nerves but shining with pride. Then I found something more fragile, a note he had typed one night when he thought no one was watching, a confession that read, "I wish I felt normal." It was so raw, so honest, that it took my breath away. The boy behind the mask of cruelty was still there, wrestling with his own fears and doubts. For the first time, I saw him not as a tormentor, but as a child lost in his own pain, using laughter to hide the cracks beneath the surface. That night, I prepared my own message, not with words to hurt, but with images to remind. I gathered the photos and videos into a presentation, each slide a piece of the puzzle that showed the family's story through a lens of love and memory. I chose pictures from when Dylan was young, carefree, the way I remembered him before the weight of adolescence pressed down on his shoulders. I included images of family vacations, birthdays, quiet moments in the garden where laughter and hope had once been abundant. The process was slow and deliberate, a ritual of reclaiming something that had been slipping away. As I worked, I thought about the power of memory and how easily it can be twisted or erased. I thought about the dinner table and the words that had cut through years of care. And I knew that I couldn't let this moment define the end of my story or the story of my family. The day I was to share the presentation arrived with a quiet tension that settled over me like a heavy coat. I brought my laptop and asked to connect it to the television in the living room where the family gathered as usual. Sheila and Ron exchanged glances. Dylan rolled his eyes, and Josh barely looked up from his phone. I smiled gently and began to click through the slides. At first, there were soft chuckles and murmurs as old photos of baby Dylan and family holidays played across the screen. Then came the notes, the candid snapshots of Dylan's struggles hidden beneath the bravado. The room grew quieter with each image, the laughter fading into something heavier, more thoughtful. Finally, I played the video Dylan had made of me, the one he posted as a joke, paired with clips of me lifting him as a toddler, spinning him in the sunlight, holding him close when the world felt too big. I spoke softly. People forget, but computers don't. The words hung in the air like a gentle rebuke, a reminder that the past we share is more than just a collection of moments. It is the foundation of who we are. Dylan's face, once flushed with amusement, now looked pale and uncertain. Sheila wiped a tear. Ron shifted uncomfortably, and Josh looked away. The silence stretched between us, thick and unspoken. That night, after everyone had left, I sat alone with my thoughts swirling like leaves in the wind. The presentation was not an act of revenge, but a reaching out, a hope to bridge the growing gap. I didn't expect apologies or declarations of love. What I needed was recognition, that beneath the years and the hurt, I was still here. The next morning, I received a message from Dylan. It was short, hesitant, but it broke the silence. "I didn't know you still saw me." I typed back with trembling fingers, "Always." And in that simple exchange, a fragile thread was woven back between us, a beginning of something new, something real. The catalyst had broken the quiet tension, cracked open the walls of silence that had been built around us, and while the road ahead remained uncertain and fraught with pain, I felt a flicker of hope. I was no longer just the grandmother mocked at the dinner table. I was a woman reclaiming her story, one image, one memory, one word at a time. After that night, when I shared the presentation and saw the silence settle like dust over the room, I thought perhaps we had crossed some invisible line and that things might start to change, even if slowly. But instead, the quiet only grew heavier, thicker, like a fog that settled deep into the bones of our family. The days that followed were marked not by dramatic confrontations or heated words, but by the slow, steady erosion of my presence in the life I had once known. It was a quiet shrinking, a subtle fading into the background where my feelings were never quite acknowledged, and my efforts to reconnect were met with polite distance. The dinner invitations became less frequent, often replaced by hastily arranged visits where the clock seemed to tick louder than the conversation. On the phone, voices grew curt and clipped, the warmth replaced by obligation. At family gatherings, I found myself sitting at the edge of rooms, the conversation swirling around me but rarely including me. as if I were a familiar piece of furniture rather than a person with a heart still beating with hope and hurt. One evening, I went to the grocery store and ran into Sheila briefly in the parking lot. She greeted me with a quick smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked if I was coming to the family barbecue the next weekend. I told her I wasn't sure, that I needed time to think. She nodded, the smile tightening, and said, "We miss you, you know. It's not the same without you." But in that moment, it felt like an echo of a past life, a life that was slipping further from my grasp. My grandson Dylan, the one who had mocked me so openly, seemed to avoid me altogether. I watched him from a distance at school events and birthday parties, a boy surrounded by friends, laughter and screens, yet always somehow out of reach. The hurt from that night had settled like a shadow between us, a silent barrier that neither of us knew how to cross. Then came the video. I had noticed his phone buzzing with the latest trends, but it wasn't until the next Sunday dinner that I truly understood the new form my pain would take. Dylan, with a smirk that felt like a challenge, pulled out his phone and showed me a TikTok video he had made, edited with clips of me struggling to get up from the couch, the screen emblazoned with the caption, "Grandma X needs reboot." The rooms erupted in laughter once more, and I felt the air leave my lungs. No one asked if it hurt. No one looked to see if the woman in the photo felt small or humiliated. It was as if my dignity was a toy to be played with, discarded and forgotten. I stopped bringing desserts to family dinners after that. The cakes and pies I once made with love went uneaten or left on the counter. No one noticed. No one asked. It was easier, I suppose, for everyone if I became smaller, quieter, less visible. The silence was worse than the words or the videos because it spoke of erasure, of being forgotten in plain sight. I spent nights curled up in my armchair, the television flickering but my mind elsewhere, replaying memories of earlier times when laughter was gentle and eyes met mine with kindness. I thought about the life I had lived. The years of care, the meals cooked, the holidays planned, the birthdays celebrated, and I wondered how it all could have led to this. A grandmother laughed at, mocked, and left on the sidelines of her own family's story. Yet beneath the hurt, a quiet flame of resilience began to grow. I remembered the photos and notes I had discovered on Dylan's phone, the boy behind the mask of cruelty, struggling with his own pain. It reminded me that beneath all of us lie vulnerabilities we sometimes hide behind harsh words or jokes. That realization didn't excuse his actions, but it gave me a new lens through which to see him, and through him, my family. One afternoon, I decided to take a small step toward reclaiming my space, not with confrontation, but with presence. I began volunteering at the community center near my apartment, helping with the weekly bingo game and organizing books in the library corner. The work was simple, the people kind, and for a few hours each week, I was reminded that I could still contribute, still matter, outside of the strained dynamics at home. On weekends, I took long walks in the park, breathing in the crisp air and allowing the silence to fill the spaces left by absence. I made a habit of carrying a small notebook, jotting down thoughts and memories, little moments that brought me joy or sorrow. One day, as I sat on a bench watching children play and couples stroll by hand in hand, I realized how much I had been holding back, how much I had silenced myself to avoid conflict or disappointment. The video, the silence, the distant glances, they had taught me a painful lesson about the cost of invisibility. But I was no longer willing to be invisible. Slowly, carefully, I began to reach out to my daughter Sheila, sending texts and letters that were gentle but clear. I wanted to be part of the family on my terms, with respect and kindness. Some messages went unanswered, others received brief replies. Still, I persisted. I started to invite myself to small gatherings, showing up with a homemade pie or a bouquet of flowers, soft reminders that I was still here, still hoping to belong. There were moments of warmth, glances that lingered a little longer, conversations that felt genuine. but they were always tempered by the undercurrent of tension, a silent question of how much space a grandmother could truly take up before being asked. To step back again. Through it all, I held on to the photographs and memories that I had curated in my mind and on my laptop. They became a silent testimony to my life, a shield against the erosion of my dignity. I learned to carry myself with a quiet pride, even when the world seemed to whisper otherwise. The first escalation was not marked by fireworks or dramatic declarations, but by a slow, painful realization that love and belonging are not always enough to protect us from neglect and erasure. It was a lesson in resilience, in finding strength in small acts of presence and refusal to disappear. And as the days stretched into weeks, I understood that this was not just a family crisis, but a reckoning with time, memory, and identity. I was not the same woman who had once poured her heart into every meal and every holiday. I was becoming someone new, someone who could bear the weight of hurt and still stand, who could reclaim her story even when the family narrative seemed bent against her. This quiet battle was far from over, but I was no longer shrinking. I was growing in my silence, preparing for the moments when I would speak, when I would insist on being seen, heard, and respected. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew that every small step I took was a step toward reclaiming not just my place at the table, but my sense of self, and that was worth everything. The shift did not come all at once, nor with fanfare or sudden clarity, but like the soft light that creeps over the horizon, steady and sure, even on the darkest mornings. After weeks of shrinking into the shadows of my own family, swallowed by silence and sidelong glances, something inside me began to stir, a quiet but unyielding urge to reclaim the woman I had been, and perhaps more importantly, to become the woman I was meant to be. It was in the small moments where this change took root, in the way I found myself lingering a little longer in the mirror, brushing my hair with a gentleness I had forgotten, choosing clothes not for comfort alone, but for how they made me feel, visible, dignified, worthy of my own attention. I began to understand that the pain I carried was not a mark of failure, but a call to transformation. The digital drawer I had discovered on Dylan's phone had been more than a glimpse into his hidden self. It had become a mirror reflecting my own quiet despair and the fierce hope that still burned within me. Those fragments of his youth, notes scribbled in moments of loneliness, photos that showed a boy wrestling with the world, reminded me that beneath the surface of hurt and anger, there was always the possibility of connection, if only we were brave, enough to reach across the divide. With this new understanding, I decided to step beyond the confines of my family's unspoken rules and into the wider world waiting just beyond my front door. I joined a local community center, volunteering in the library and at social events. The people I met there were strangers in some ways, but also kindred spirits who carried their own stories of loss, hope, and resilience. In the rhythm of those days, I found a new sense of belonging, a place where my presence was valued not as a relic of the past, but as a living, breathing part of a larger tapestry. Each morning, I walked to the center with a sense of purpose, carrying a small notebook where I jotted down thoughts, memories, and dreams. Sometimes I would pause on the way home to sit on a park bench, watching children play and couples stroll by hand in hand, reminding myself that life continued to move forward, and so must I. The rhythm of my days began to shift, as did my view of the family I had once known so intimately. I saw now that the silence and cruelty were not merely the failings of individuals, but part of a larger pattern of fear and misunderstanding that had woven itself through our lives like a tangled thread. I no longer sought to erase the hurt, but to understand it, to find a way to live with it without being consumed by it. One afternoon, Sheila called unexpectedly. Her voice was softer than before, tinged with a vulnerability that surprised me. She asked about the presentation, about Dylan's reaction, and whether I was doing all right. I told her about the community center, about the small steps I was taking to rebuild myself outside of the family's expectations. She listened, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the tentative beginnings of a bridge being rebuilt. The change within me was not only about reclaiming my dignity, but about setting boundaries, gentle but firm, around what I would accept and what I would no longer endure. I began to say no to invitations that felt like obligations, and yes to moments that nourished my spirit. I learned to recognize the difference between presence and performance, between being truly seen and merely tolerated. The digital world I had once approached with hesitation became a place of connection rather than exclusion. I started to share some of my own memories and photos online, small glimpses of a life lived fully and with love. Friends I had not spoken to in years reached out, their words weaving a new web of support and encouragement. In the quiet hours of the evening, I found myself writing letters, not always to be sent, but to untangle my thoughts and feelings. One such letter was addressed to Dylan, not with anger or blame, but with an openness I had not felt in years. I told him I saw him, not just the boy who had mocked me, but the young man searching for himself. I told him I was ready to listen when he was ready to speak. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the weight of isolation began to lift. I found joy in small victories, a conversation that felt honest, a walk taken without pain, a smile shared with a stranger. The transformation was neither dramatic nor complete, but it was real, and it was mine. I was no longer waiting for the family to welcome me back on their terms. I was stepping into a life defined by my own terms, shaped by the lessons of the past, but not imprisoned by them. This midpoint was not a triumphant declaration, but a quiet awakening, a turning of the heart toward hope, resilience, and the possibility of new beginnings. And in that awakening, I found the strength to keep moving forward, to keep speaking my truth, and to keep believing that the woman I was becoming was worthy of love, respect, and peace. The past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you try to run, no matter how carefully you build new walls or craft new stories. Just when I thought I had begun to breathe, to live again in a quiet space of my own making, the old voices rose once more, breaking the fragile peace with the sound of unanswered demands and familiar disappointment. It started with a letter from Kieran, my oldest grandchild, the one who had always been the quietest presence in our family, the boy who once spent an afternoon with me painting a birdhouse bright red, declaring it the coolest spot in the entire yard. His letter was short, carefully worded with the innocence and hope of youth, asking if I was okay, telling me that his parents were worried, that they missed me. It was the first true connection I had felt in months, a slender thread reaching through the silence. I didn't respond right away, not because I was angry or stubborn, but because I was still learning how to navigate this new life, how to balance the past and the present without being pulled under by either. Then came the visit from Lisa. She appeared suddenly one gray Thursday afternoon at the cafe where I had begun working, standing stiffly by the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu as if trying to hide in plain sight. Her coat was too polished for the drizzle, her expression unreadable, but her eyes flicked toward me with the same calculation I remembered all too well. I finished refilling the sugar caddies and let her wait, letting the silence grow heavy between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, a fragile attempt at civility. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded and gestured toward the empty booth at the back, the place where we would sit not as adversaries, but as weary travelers forced to share a space neither of us chose willingly. Lisa began by telling me that she hadn't known Adam was sending someone, that the lawyer was not her idea, and then, with a brittle honesty I hadn't expected, she admitted they panicked, that the flight was boarding, the kids cranky, and they thought I was behind them. 8 hours, Lisa. 8 hours, I said quietly, the weight of those hours settling between us like a stone. She looked down at her hands, perfectly manicured as always, and didn't meet my eyes. "I didn't think you'd leave," she whispered. "I didn't," I replied. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it to me. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "But Kieran, he's struggling, he misses you. Adam's furious. But Kieran, he's different." I took the envelope not because I wanted what was inside, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of refusing it outright. Inside were photographs of Kieran as a child, me holding him on my hip in the garden, both of us laughing. Behind them, a note in his handwriting, "I remember." I always remembered. 5 words, small but enough to hold the rest of the week in place. The visit left me shaken, reminded that while I was building a new life, the old one was still trying to pull me back. Soon after, Adam hired a lawyer, Derek Sorensen, a man with a carefully measured voice and eyes that watched me as though I were a problem to be solved. He came to the cafe unannounced one afternoon, asking questions about my well-being, my living situation, my intentions. He spoke of concern, of safety, of next steps, as if I were a child or a patient rather than a woman standing firmly on her own 2 feet. I listened, folded my apron, and told him plainly that I was not a pet to be controlled, that there were no next steps unless I chose them. I left the cafe with the weight of his gaze following me out the door, but I did not look back. The lawyer's visit was a clear message. They wanted to take back control, to rewrite the narrative where I was the vulnerable grandmother in need of protection, rather than the woman who had chosen to leave. Then came the newspaper article. It arrived quietly, slipped through the mail with a return address from my old hometown, Wilmington. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family Speaks Out on Grandmother's Disappearance." The article was filled with quotes from Adam and Lisa, their words carefully crafted to evoke concern, to paint me as fragile and lost. "We're deeply worried," Adam said. "She vanished without a word. We just want her safe." Lisa's voice was trembling in print. "She's vulnerable. We fear something happened. She's not the type to do something like this." I laughed, a sharp, startled sound that surprised even me. Not the type. That was the cruelest part. Their performance of innocence, their feigned helplessness as if I had wandered off into traffic instead of being packed like luggage and left behind. Heather, my co-worker at the cafe, found the article one busy morning and quietly handed it to me, her eyes searching mine for some sign of how I was taking it. "You okay?" she asked softly. "Never better," I replied, though the words tasted bitter. The article became proof not of my disappearance, but of how people only start to worry when they can no longer use you. I kept the clipping not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. Proof that the family who claimed to care was more interested in controlling than understanding. Throughout all this, the quiet support of people like Heather and Arthur, the widower who came to the cafe every morning with his stories about birds and lost loves, kept me grounded. They didn't ask about the past, didn't press for explanations. They simply showed up, offering small kindnesses in a world that often seemed indifferent. Yet the pressure from the past was relentless. Lisa showed up again, this time at the cafe, her expression softer but no less determined. She brought an envelope, another attempt to bridge the gap or perhaps to stake a claim. I refused to be the object of their pity or the pawn in their attempts to reclaim me. Instead, I wrote a letter, not to Adam, not to Lisa, but to Kieran. It was a letter of peace, of boundaries, and of hope. I told him I was safe, that I had built a new life not out of anger but necessity. I told him he was the only one who never made me feel like an obligation, that he could visit if he came alone, on my terms. The letter was a fragile olive branch, a gesture of trust after so much silence. The response came slowly, but it came. And in that slow unfolding, I found something precious. the possibility of connection without control, of love without condition. The second escalation was not a storm, but a slow rising tide. Old wounds reopened, new challenges presented, and the ever-present question of who I was to be in a family that seemed determined to forget me. But through it all, I stood firm, learning that strength is not only in confrontation, but in the quiet refusal to be erased. This was not just a battle for my place in the family, but a reclaiming of my voice, my story, and my right to be seen as I am. Flawed, hurt, but unbroken. The past may reach out with its long shadows, but I am no longer afraid to face it. I'm learning slowly that the only true power is the power to choose, to stay or to walk away, to forgive or to hold firm, to be heard or to speak in silence. And in that choice, I find my freedom. The moment I decided to take back my story was not marked by anger or dramatic confrontation, but by a stillness that gathered strength with every breath I took. It was a quiet, deliberate act that felt both terrifying and necessary, as if the weight of years had finally settled into a clarity I could no longer deny. The night before, I had sat at my small kitchen table, the lamp casting a soft glow over the faded photographs and old recipe cards I had kept for decades. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I had been carefully building. Photos, letters, notes, and videos that told the truth of my life, the real story behind the smiles and silences. The folder was a testament to years of love, resilience, and sacrifice, but also of pain and neglect, of laughter that sometimes masked tears. I prepared a presentation, not for revenge, but for revelation. I wanted the family to see, not just remember, the woman I had been and the woman I was reclaiming. The day of the presentation, I arrived at the house where dinner was to be held, carrying my laptop and a quiet determination. The air was heavy with unspoken tensions, the kind that settle in the spaces between words and linger long after the room falls silent. Sheila greeted me with a fragile smile, Ron avoided my gaze, and Dylan sat with an expression that flickered between defiance and something I dared to call hesitation. I asked to connect my laptop to the television, a simple request met with a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled skepticism. As the first images flickered onto the screen, I watched the room change. Childhood photos of Dylan laughing, playing, and dreaming filled the screen, softening the edges of the moment. Then came the notes. Hidden thoughts Dylan had never meant to share, messages written in the quiet of night when the world felt heavy and uncertain. The atmosphere shifted again as I played the video he had made of me, the one he used to mock me, now paired with clips of me holding him as a child, spinning him in the garden, whispering promises of love and safety. I spoke softly but clearly. People forget, but computers don't. The words hung in the air like a gentle yet unyielding truth, a reminder that memory is not so easily erased. Dylan's face turned pale, his eyes searching mine for an answer he was not sure he wanted. Sheila's cheeks glistened with tears, and Ron's usual reserve cracked just enough to reveal the burden he carried beneath his polished exterior. The silence that followed was thick with things unsaid, regrets, apologies, and the fragile hope of healing. It was in that silence that I found my power, not in words shouted or accusations thrown, but in the undeniable presence of truth laid bare. After the presentation, the room felt changed, as if the air itself had been cleansed by the honesty we had shared. Dylan did not speak that night, but 2 days later his message came, a simple, tentative reach across the chasm. "I didn't know you still saw me." I answered, "Always." That exchange marked the beginning of a new chapter, fragile and uncertain, but filled with possibility. I realized then that reclaiming my story was not about erasing the past or demanding forgiveness, but about creating space for understanding and connection on my terms. The act of sharing those memories was both a release and a claim, a way to say, I am here. I have lived. I matter. It was a turning point that shifted the balance from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. In the days that followed, the family began to shift as well. Dinners were quieter, more tentative, but there was an undercurrent of change, a recognition that the woman at the table was not the shadow she had once been, but a force to be reckoned with. Dylan brought his own dessert, a small gesture loaded with meaning, and once, when I faltered reaching for a glass, he steadied my hand without a word. These moments, small but significant, were the new foundation upon which we began to rebuild. Yet, even as the bonds began to mend, I knew the journey was far from over. The scars of neglect and dismissal would not vanish overnight, and the path to true reconciliation would be winding and uncertain. But I was ready to walk it, with patience and courage, with the quiet strength that had carried me this far. That night, after everyone had left, I sat by the window, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky. The house was filled with the soft hum of life, a testament to the love and struggle that had shaped us all. I thought about the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming, and I felt a deep sense of peace. The climax of my story was not a final battle won or a dramatic victory declared, but a quiet reclaiming of dignity and self. It was the moment when I stopped waiting for others to see me and chose to see myself clearly, fully, without apology. And in that seeing, I found freedom, the freedom to be flawed, to be hurt, to be human, and above all, to be whole. The days after the presentation settled into a quiet rhythm, a gentle unfolding of moments that held the weight of change without shouting it aloud. The house where I had once felt like a stranger began to feel different, not because the walls themselves had shifted, but because I had shifted within them. Dylan's messages came more often, tentative threads weaving a new connection between us, fragile yet sincere. He didn't rush to fill the silence with words, but when he did speak, it was with a softness that surprised me. Our dinners, though still awkward in their way, were no longer battlegrounds of unspoken resentments, but spaces where we began to learn each other anew. Sometimes he would ask if I needed help, sometimes he would share stories from school or music, and once he even suggested we cook together. That simple offer was a quiet victory, a bridge built on the hope of something better. The family, too, seemed to adjust slowly. Sheila's smiles grew warmer, her voice less tentative, and Ron's once distant presence softened into something more familiar. There was no grand reconciliation, no sweeping apologies, but in the small shifts and subtle acknowledgments, I found the beginnings of healing. Yet even as these new connections took root, I knew that the most profound change was the one within myself. I had moved from a place of pain and invisibility into a space of quiet strength and self-recognition. The woman who had once shrunk away from the world was learning to stand tall, not because she demanded it of others, but because she had claimed it for herself. One evening, sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, the air thick with the scent of rain and earth, I wrote a letter, not to the family, not to Dylan, but to myself. I wrote of the long journey through silence and shadows, of the moments of doubt and despair, and of the fierce determination that had carried me forward. I wrote that I was proud, not just of the woman I had been, but of the woman I was becoming. I sealed the letter and tucked it into the drawer where I kept my most precious things, a quiet promise to remember my own worth when the world might try to forget it again. The phone, once a source of anxiety and hurt, became a tool of connection rather than fear. I answered calls with a new confidence, returned messages without hesitation, and even reached out to old friends whose voices I had missed. The digital world, once a place of exclusion, became a space where I could share my story, find support, and offer strength to others who felt invisible. The small apartment, once a refuge from the chaos of family conflict, grew into a home filled with laughter, light, and the quiet hum of everyday life. I began to volunteer more, joining book clubs and community groups, weaving a network of friendship and purpose that extended beyond blood and history. Through these connections, I found a renewed sense of belonging that was not tied to the roles I had once played, but rooted in the woman I was now free to be. And then came the unexpected moment of grace, a visit from Kieran. He arrived quietly, no fanfare, no demands, just the boy who had always been different, stepping into my world with a gentle smile and open heart. We talked for hours, sharing stories, hopes and fears, building a bridge of trust that neither of us had dared to imagine before. There were no promises made, no guarantees of what the future held, only the simple truth that we were here, together, choosing connection over distance. As the seasons turned, I continued to walk this path of healing and self-discovery. I learned that forgiveness is not always about forgetting, but about releasing the grip of pain so that the heart can open again. I learned that strength often looks like quiet persistence rather than loud declarations. And I learned that the most important relationship is the one I have with myself, a relationship built on kindness, patience, and unwavering respect. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see not just the woman who was mocked and dismissed, but the woman who stood up, who spoke her truth, and who reclaimed her life with grace and courage. I am no longer waiting for anyone else to give me permission to be seen or heard. I am enough, just as I am. If this story reaches you, if you find yourself caught in the shadows of neglect or dismissal, know this: you are not alone, and your story is not over. It is never too late to choose yourself, to stand up, and to walk toward the life you deserve. You are worthy of love, respect, and joy, not because others say so, but because you say so to yourself. When you are ready, take that step. And if you ever need a hand to hold or a voice to remind you of your worth, I will be here. We will rise together, one quiet moment at a time. In the months that followed, life settled into something quieter, but not the hollow kind of quiet I had once feared. It was the stillness of a garden after the storm has passed, when the air feels cleaner, the ground firmer, and you can hear the sound of your own breath without the weight of tension pressing down. I no longer walked into family gatherings expecting warmth or validation. I went, if I went at all, because I chose to, not because I feared the consequences of absence. There was freedom in that choice. Dylan changed in small ways that only someone who had loved him since the beginning would notice. He no longer avoided my gaze, and sometimes he even sought it out, as though checking for something. Permission, perhaps, or understanding. When we spoke, there was still the casual tone of a teenager, but threaded through it was a cautious respect that hadn't been there before. Once, as he was leaving, he lingered at the door and said, "You're different now." I smiled and told him, "I always was. You just see it now." I continued to fill my days with the community I had found beyond my family's reach. The library at the community center became a second home, and I began running a weekly story circle for anyone who wanted to come and share. People arrived with hesitant voices, sometimes bringing only silence, but by the end of an hour, the room would be alive with laughter, tears, and the kind of honesty that felt almost sacred. In their stories, I found pieces of my own. The presentation I had made for Dylan was never shown again, but I kept it saved, tucked away in a folder labeled Truth. I didn't need to use it a second time. Its purpose had been fulfilled. It had been my line in the sand, my way of saying, "I will not be erased." And in its wake, the family learned, in their own awkward and halting way, that my presence came with boundaries and with a voice they could not silence. Sheila and I began speaking more often, our conversations no longer weighed down entirely by the unspoken. We didn't rewrite history, but we began writing new pages, lighter ones. She sometimes asked about my work at the center, and I sometimes asked about hers. It was a careful dance, but one that felt worth continuing. Ron remained reserved, though there were moments when I caught him watching me with something like regret in his eyes. I didn't press him for words. I had learned that some apologies come not in sentences, but in softened edges. The most surprising change came one rainy afternoon when Dylan stopped by unexpectedly. He brought a flash drive and handed it to me, saying, "It's for you. No one else has seen it." On it were photos and videos, his own version of a truth folder. There were snapshots of him with friends, moments from school, silly recordings, but also quiet, vulnerable pieces of himself he had never shared. It was his way of trusting me again, of letting me see the boy behind the bravado. I realized then that our bond would never be what it once was. It would be something different, born of conflict but strengthened by honesty. And maybe that was better. Maybe love that survives fire is stronger for it. Now, when I think back to the night of that dinner, the sting is still there, but it no longer defines me. It is simply a chapter in a much larger story, a story of endurance, of quiet reclamation, and of the way truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced. I have learned that sometimes justice doesn't come in grand gestures or public reckonings, but in the small, private victories that remind you of your own worth. Justice, for me, was no longer waiting for them to apologize. It was standing tall in my own life, knowing I had nothing to prove to anyone but myself. If there is a lesson I carry from all of this, it is that invisibility is not a permanent state. You can choose to step into the light even if your hands shake when you do it. You can tell your story even if your voice trembles. And you can reclaim your dignity even if no one stands to cheer for you. I'm no longer afraid of being forgotten because I remember myself. I no longer fear their silence because my voice is steady. And I no longer measure my worth by the place I hold in their gatherings because I have built my own table and it is full. So when I see Dylan now, laughing without cruelty, speaking without the edge that once cut me, I feel not just relief but gratitude. Gratitude that I chose not to disappear. Gratitude that I found the courage to turn pain into something unshakable. And above all, gratitude that, in the end, I stayed true to myself. This, I think, is the real ending, not the presentation, not the tears, not even the tentative truce with my family. The real ending is this quiet certainty. I am still here. I am still me, and that is enough.